She stood in the doorway of his restaurant like an elegant storm, her voice cutting through the ambient chatter with quiet devastation. I said I have a reservation, but David had already made his choice, one that would change both their lives forever. Welcome back to our family of storytellers and dreamers. If you believe in second chances and the power of love to transform even the hardest hearts, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between what's comfortable and what's right? Because tomorrow I'm bringing you another story about courage, redemption, and love that will leave you speechless. Now let me tell you about the day a restaurant owner's prejudice collided with destiny, and how sometimes the people who hurt us most become the ones who change our lives forever. The late afternoon sun caught the crystal chandelier of Le Bernardo, casting rainbow fragments across white tablecloths as David Rousseau adjusted his tie for the third time. 28 years old and already drowning in the weight of his father's legacy, he moved between tables with practiced precision, his sharp blue eyes scanning every detail. The restaurant had been in his family for 60 years, a temple of French cuisine, where senators dined and business deals were sealed over wine older than most customers. Mr. Rousseau, Marie, his hostess, approached with nervous energy. The Henderson party is asking about wine pairings again. David nodded, his jaw tight. Since taking over from his father last year, every service felt like walking a tightrope. The old man had built this place on tradition, on maintaining standards that David was still learning to understand. The weight of expectation pressed against his chest like a physical force. Tell them I'll be right over, he said, straightening his shoulders. The late lunch crowd was his bread and butter, established clients who expected perfection and paid handsomely for it. Across town, Amara Chen Williams sat in her Tesla, checking her phone one final time before the most important business lunch of her career. At 31, she had built her real estate empire from nothing, transforming rundown properties into architectural gems that commanded premium rents. Today's meeting could secure the Meridian District project, 12 blocks of prime real estate that would establish her as one of the city's most powerful developers. She caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting the collar of her tailored burgundy blazer. Her grandmother's pearl earrings caught the light, a reminder of the woman who had taught her that dignity was not negotiable. You walk into every room like you own it, baby girl, Grandma Rose used to say, because respect is something you give yourself first. The reservation at Le Bernardo had been her client's suggestion, neutral territory for a deal that would reshape the city's skyline. Amara had researched the restaurant meticulously, noting its reputation for discretion and excellence. She needed every advantage today. As she gathered her leather portfolio, her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. Chen Industries contracts ready for signature. This is it, boss. You've got this. David watched the Henderson party leave, their satisfied nods a small victory in what had been a challenging week. 2 servers had called in sick. The new sous chef was struggling with the sauce consistency, and his landlord had been making noise about rent increases. The pressure felt relentless. But this restaurant was all he knew, all he'd ever wanted to know. He retreated to his office, a cramped space behind the kitchen where his father's portrait still hung above the desk. François Rousseau's stern gaze seemed to follow David's every move, a constant reminder of the man's final words. This place is about more than food, David. It's about maintaining standards, about knowing who belongs and who doesn't. The old man's voice still echoed in his head during difficult decisions, shaping choices David sometimes didn't fully understand himself. Meanwhile, Amara pulled into the valet area of Le Bernardo, her confidence masking the familiar knot in her stomach that preceded important meetings. She had learned long ago to armor herself in professionalism, to speak first and decisively in rooms where her presence was questioned before her qualifications were even considered. The restaurant's facade impressed her understated elegance with just enough grandeur to signal serious business. She handed her keys to the valet, a young man who nodded respectfully and walked toward the entrance with the poised stride that had carried her through boardrooms and construction sites alike. The hostess station gleamed under soft lighting, and Amara could smell the delicate aroma of herbs and wine that marked truly exceptional cuisine. This was exactly the kind of place where million-dollar deals were made over handshake agreements. She approached the podium where a young woman with nervous energy was consulting a reservation book. "Good afternoon," Amara said, her voice warm but professional. "I have a reservation for 2 at 3:30. Williams." Marie's eyes flicked to her reservation book, then back to Amira with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Williams, Let me just check with management about table availability. Something cold settled in Emma's chest, a familiar sensation she'd learned to recognize over years of navigating predominantly white spaces. The restaurant was only half full, with several empty tables clearly visible through the archway to the main dining room. I made this reservation 3 days ago, Amara said carefully, her voice maintaining its professional warmth even as her internal alerts began firing. It should be confirmed. Marie's smile tightened. Of course. Just one moment. David emerged from the kitchen, surveying the dining room with proprietorial satisfaction. The lunch service had gone smoothly, and the afternoon promised to be profitable. His father's voice whispered in his mind as he noticed Marie's hesitation at the hostess stand. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts about who belongs, son. He approached the podium, his gaze taking in Amara's expensive blazer, her confident posture, the way she carried herself with unmistakable authority. For a split second, something flickered in his chest. A recognition of her elegance, her poise. Then his father's training kicked in, overlaying his perception with assumptions he'd inherited like the restaurant's china patterns. Is there a problem, Marie? His voice carried the easy authority of ownership. This is Mr. Rousseau, our owner, Marie said with obvious relief. There seems to be some confusion about the Williams reservation. David's eyes met Amara's directly for the first time, and the moment stretched between them like a held breath. She was beautiful in a way that caught him off guard, not just her features, but the intelligence that blazed in her dark eyes, the way she held herself like she could command any room she entered. I'm afraid we don't have any availability this afternoon, he heard himself saying, the words emerging from some deep-seated programming he hadn't consciously chosen to activate. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the establishments down the street. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Amara felt the familiar burn rise in her throat. Not surprised because she'd experienced this dance too many times to be surprised, but a deep soul-level exhaustion at having to prove her humanity once again. She could feel the stares of nearby diners beginning to turn their way, the hush that came when social theater was about to unfold. I have a confirmed reservation, she repeated, her voice dropping to a register that should have warned him. She reached into her purse and produced her phone, scrolling to the confirmation email with movements that were deliberately controlled. Table, for 2 at 3:30. Williams, Williams. David felt heat creep up his neck as he saw the confirmation right there in black and white. Time-stamped 3 days ago, but something deeper than logic was driving him now. His father's voice, the weight of tradition, the assumption that he was protecting something sacred. I'm sorry, he said, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. We reserve the right to refuse service. Perhaps you'd be happier somewhere more suitable. The word suitable landed like a slap. Amara's grandmother had taught her many things, but perhaps the most important was this. Dignity was not about never feeling pain, but about how you carried yourself through it. She straightened to her full height, her voice remaining steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. I see. 2 words, spoken so quietly that David had to lean forward to hear them. And what exactly makes me unsuitable for your establishment, Mr. Rousseau? The question hung between them like a challenge, and David felt something crack in his chest. He could see the hurt flickering behind her professional mask, could feel the eyes of his staff and customers watching this moment that would define him. His father's voice urged him forward, but another part of him, a part he'd been taught to ignore, wanted to apologize, wanted to step back from the cliff he was walking toward. Instead, he doubled down. We cater to a very specific clientele here. I'm sure you understand. Amara nodded slowly, as if his words confirmed something she'd already known. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made David's stomach twist with an emotion he couldn't name. I understand perfectly. She closed her phone with deliberate care and tucked it back into her purse. You've made yourself very clear. She turned to leave, then paused, looking back at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. For what it's worth, Mr. Rousseau, I hope someday you learn the difference between standards and prejudice. For your sake, not mine. As she walked toward the door, her heels clicking against marble with military precision, David felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The restaurant seemed suddenly too quiet, too small, too focused on the moment he'd just created. At the door, Amara stopped and pulled out her business card, thick, elegant cardstock, that proclaimed Chen Williams Development in embossed gold letters. She placed it deliberately on the hostess stand. When you're ready to learn that lesson, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the dining room. You know where to find me. The door closed behind her with the soft finality of a coffin lid. David stared at the business card, his hands trembling slightly as he picked it up. Chen Williams Development. He'd heard that name before, seen it in the business section of the newspaper, connected to some of the city's most prestigious projects. In the space of 5 minutes, he had revealed something about himself that he wasn't sure he wanted to acknowledge. And she had walked away with a dignity that made his own behavior feel small and dirty. The restaurant resumed its quiet hum, but David felt like something essential had been broken, that could never quite be repaired. David stood frozen at the hostess stand for a full minute after Amara left, her business card burning against his fingertips like a brand. Around him, the restaurant's elegant atmosphere felt suddenly suffocating, as if the crystal chandelier might crash down at any moment. Mr. Rousseau? Marie's voice seemed to come from very far away. The Morrison party is here for their 4 o'clock. He blinked, forcing himself back to the present. Business. Normal operations. The rhythm that had governed his life since childhood. He slipped Amara's card into his jacket pocket and straightened his tie, a gesture that felt more like armor than grooming. Of course, seat them at table 7. But even as he moved through the motions of service, David's mind replayed the encounter in excruciating detail. The way Amara had said, I understand perfectly, not with anger but with a kind of weary recognition that suggested this wasn't her first time facing such treatment. The dignity with which she'd walked away, turning what should have been his moment of authority into something that felt distinctly like defeat. She was probably trying to make some kind of statement, he told himself, refilling water glasses with unnecessary precision. These people always have an agenda, but the thought felt hollow even as he tried to embrace it. Her reservation had been legitimate, her attire impeccable, her manner professional and courteous until he had chosen to humiliate her. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he retreated to his office, closing the door against the gentle chaos of the dinner prep beginning in the kitchen. His father's portrait seemed to glare down at him with increased intensity, but for the first time in his adult life, David found himself questioning the wisdom in those painted eyes. You did what you had to do, he told himself firmly. Dad built this place on maintaining standards, on knowing our clientele. But another voice, one he'd spent years suppressing, whispered back, what standards? What did she actually do wrong? 15 blocks away, Amara sat in her Tesla in the parking garage beneath her office building, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She'd been sitting there for 20 minutes, trying to summon the emotional energy to walk into her company's headquarters and pretend the afternoon had gone according to plan. Her phone had been buzzing incessantly, her client wondering where she was for their rescheduled meeting, her assistant asking if she needed the contracts revised, her business partner wanting to know if the Meridian deal was moving forward. She couldn't bring herself to answer any of them. Just another ignorant restaurant owner, she told herself, finally releasing her death grip on the wheel. You've dealt with worse. This is nothing. But it wasn't nothing, and she knew it. Each incident like this chipped away at something essential, forced her to expend energy on proving her basic humanity that should have been spent on building her empire. She thought of her grandmother's words about walking into every room like you owned it, and felt a stab of grief for the naive confidence she'd possessed before the world had taught her that ownership could be questioned at any moment. Her phone rang. Marcus Chen, her business partner and the closest thing she had to family since her grandmother's passing. Amara? Where are you? The Hendersons are asking about contract modifications, and I don't want to move forward without... I'm fine, she interrupted, her voice clipped with the effort of maintaining control. Just running late. Tell them I'll be up in 5 minutes. Are you sure you're okay? You sound... I said I'm fine, Marcus. But even Marcus, for all his loyalty and friendship, couldn't truly understand what it felt like to have your worthiness questioned before you'd spoken a single word. Mara forced herself to get out of the car, to ride the elevator to the 15th floor, where Chen Williams Development occupied a suite of offices with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She'd built this. Every gleaming building in her line of sight represented hours of negotiation, months of planning, years of proving that she belonged in rooms where she was the only face that looked like hers. Boss? Her assistant Jennifer looked up with relief. The Hendersons are in conference room A, and I've got the revised contracts ready for your review. Amira nodded, slipping seamlessly into her professional persona like putting on a well-tailored suit. This was her domain, her kingdom built brick by brick and deal by deal. Here she was untouchable. But even as she walked toward the conference room, her mind drifted back to David Rousseau's blue eyes, to the moment of hesitation she'd seen there before he'd chosen cruelty over courage. There had been something in his expression, a flicker of recognition, maybe even attraction, before the shutters had come down. Don't, she warned herself. Don't make excuses for him. Don't look for humanity in someone who couldn't see yours. Have you ever had to choose between standing up for your values and taking the easy path? What did you choose and why? Let us know in the comments. She pushed open the conference room door, smile bright and professional, ready to close the deal that would add another zero to her net worth. But David Rousseau's business card felt like it was burning a hole in her purse, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over, because the universe, she was learning, had a twisted sense of humor about these things. 3 days later, David sat across from his accountant, Harold Winters, watching the older man's face grow increasingly grim as he reviewed the restaurant's financial statements. The morning light streaming through the office window felt harsh, exposing every worn edge of the furniture David couldn't afford to replace. "Who bought the building?" David asked, though he dreaded the answer. Harold consulted his notes. Chin Williams Development. They've been acquiring properties throughout this district for some kind of mixed-use development project. Very aggressive buyers, from what I understand. The name hit David like a physical blow. He fumbled in his jacket pocket, pulling out the business card he'd been carrying for 3 days like a talisman of shame. The gold lettering seemed to mock him. Chin Williams Development. "Jesus," he whispered. "You know them?" Harold looked up with interest. "Maybe you could leverage that relationship." "No." The word came out sharper than David intended. "No, we've met." Harold's expression brightened with misplaced optimism. "Well, that's excellent. Personal connections are everything in real estate. I'm sure if you reached out directly—" "Harold, stop!" David stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the street where his restaurant's burgundy awning provided a splash of color among the gray storefronts. "It's complicated." But even as he said it, David knew complicated was an understatement. He had humiliated a woman who now held his livelihood in her hands. The poetic justice was so perfect it felt orchestrated by some malevolent deity with a taste for irony. His phone buzzed with a text from Marie. "New landlord's representative here for property inspection. Says it's required before lease renewal." David's hands trembled slightly as he typed back, "Be right there." "I have to go," he told Harold, who was still mumbling about leveraging personal relationships and finding win-win solutions. "We'll figure something out." But as David walked the 3 blocks back to his restaurant, he felt like a man approaching his own execution. Amira stood in the middle of Bernardo's dining room, her tablet in hand as she made notes about the property's condition. She wore a charcoal gray suit that was all business, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look untouchable. But her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. When Marcus had told her about the Meridian District acquisitions, she'd reviewed the list of properties with detached professional interest. Le Bernardo had been just another line item, another asset to be evaluated and optimized. It wasn't until this morning, when she'd decided to conduct the property inspection personally, that she'd made the connection. Now she stood in the scene of her humiliation, legally entitled to be there, holding all the power in a situation that had once left her powerless. The irony wasn't lost on her, but neither was the hollow feeling in her chest. "This is business," she reminded herself, examining the crown molding that needed repair. "Personal feelings have nothing to do with property management." But even as she tried to maintain professional detachment, she could smell the herbs and wine that had perfumed her embarrassment 3 days ago. Could see the exact spot where she'd stood while David Rousseau had deemed her unsuitable for his establishment. "Ma'am?" A young woman approached nervously, the same hostess who had witnessed Amara's humiliation. "I'm Marie, the hostess. Is there anything you need to see specifically?" Amara looked at Marie for a long moment, seeing the recognition dawning in the girl's eyes. The memory of that afternoon hung between them like smoke. "Just a routine inspection," Amara said carefully. "Building maintenance, safety compliance, that sort of thing." Marie nodded, but her discomfort was palpable. "Mr. Rousseau should be here shortly if you need to speak with him about anything." The words sent a jolt through Amara's system. She'd known this confrontation was inevitable from the moment she decided to conduct the inspection herself. But knowing and being prepared were two different things entirely. "That won't be necessary," she said, though her voice betrayed the slightest tremor. "I'm just here to evaluate the property." The front door opened with its familiar chime, and Amara felt every muscle in her body tense without her permission. She didn't turn around, but she could feel David's presence like heat from a fire, could imagine his shock as recognition set in. "Marie, I got your text about the inspection." The words died in his throat. Amar turned slowly, meeting his eyes across the dining room that had been the scene of their first collision. He looked exactly as she remembered, sharp blue eyes, aristocratic features, the kind of effortless elegance that came from generations of privilege, but now his face was pale with what might have been shock or guilt or fear. "Mr. Rousseau." Her voice was steady, professional, giving away nothing of the storm raging in her chest. "I'm here to conduct a property inspection as part of the lease renewal process." David stared at her for a moment that stretched into eternity, his mouth opening and closing like a man who had forgotten how to speak. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet operations, servers setting up for the evening service, the soft clink of silverware being polished, the mundane sounds of a business trying to survive another day. "You," he managed finally, and the single word carried the weight of recognition, disbelief, and dawning horror. "Me," Amara confirmed, her voice carrying just enough edge to remind him exactly who he was dealing with. "I trust this won't be a problem. I know how particular you are about your clientele." The words hit their mark, and she watched him flinch as if she'd struck him physically. Good. Let him feel a fraction of what she'd felt 3 days ago. But even as satisfaction coursed through her, Amara caught something else in his expression, genuine remorse. Maybe, or the beginning of understanding. It complicated the clean narrative of revenge she'd been constructing, made the situation messier than she wanted it to be. "Ms. Williams," he said, and she noticed he got her name right this time, pronounced it with a careful precision that suggested he'd been thinking about it. We need to talk." "No," she said firmly, turning her attention back to her tablet. "We need you to pass this inspection so I can make my recommendation to the board about your lease renewal. Everything else is irrelevant." But even as she spoke, Amara could feel the weight of his gaze on her, could sense the conversation hovering between them like a storm cloud waiting to break. They were trapped in this space together, her by professional obligation, him by desperate necessity, and she realized that walking away wasn't going to be an option this time. For better or worse, they were going to have to deal with each other. The inspection proceeded in tense silence, with Amara methodically documenting everything from water pressure to electrical compliance, while David trailed behind her like a man walking to his execution. The kitchen passed muster, the dining room showed only minor wear, but when they reached the cramped office behind the service area, Amara stopped short. The portrait above the desk commanded immediate attention. An older man with David's sharp features but harder eyes, wearing the same expression of rigid authority that she'd seen on David's face 3 days ago. The nameplate read, "Francois Rousseau." "Your father?" she asked. Though the resemblance made the question rhetorical, David's jaw tightened. "Yes, he passed last year." Amara studied the portrait, noting the way it dominated the small space, the way David seemed to shrink slightly under its painted gaze. "He looks formidable." "That's one word for it." David's voice carried an undertone of something resentment maybe, or exhaustion. "He ran this place for 45 years, had very definite ideas about how things should be done." As Amara made notes about the office's outdated electrical outlets, a framed newspaper clipping caught her eye. The headline read, "Local restaurant stands firm on traditional values," dated just 2 years ago. The accompanying photo showed Francois Rousseau standing proudly in front of Le Bernardo, his arms crossed in defiant satisfaction. Without thinking, she reached for the frame to read the article more closely. "Don't." David's voice was sharp with panic, but he was too late. Amara's eyes were already scanning the text, and with each line her expression grew more stony. "We've always catered to a refined clientele who appreciate authentic French cuisine and proper atmosphere," Rousseau explained when asked about the restaurant's reputation for exclusivity. "Not everyone understands what we're trying to maintain here. Some people are simply more compatible with our establishment's culture." The article detailed complaints filed against the restaurant over the years, subtle discrimination disguised as standards, patterns of behavior that had somehow never resulted in legal consequences, but had earned Francois Rousseau a reputation in certain circles as a man who knew how to keep undesirable elements out of his establishment. Amara set the frame down with deliberate care, her hands steady despite the rage building in her chest. "Your father was a bigot." The words hung in the air like an accusation and a challenge. David flinched as if she'd slapped him, but he didn't deny it. "He was old-fashioned," he said weakly. then immediately hated himself with a pathetic justification. Old-fashioned. Amara's voice was flat, dangerous. Is that what you call it when you systematically exclude people based on the color of their skin? David sank into his father's chair, suddenly looking much younger than his 28 years. He taught me that the restaurant was about maintaining traditions, about preserving something valuable. I thought I was protecting what he built by continuing his legacy of discrimination. I didn't think of it that way. The words exploded out of him, raw and desperate. He would tell me stories about customers who didn't appreciate what we offered, who complained about prices or didn't understand the culture we were trying to create. He made it sound like we were guardians of something important. Amara leaned against the doorframe, studying him with eyes that missed nothing. And you never questioned whether those stories might be covering up something uglier. David's silence was answer enough. Let me tell you a story, Mr. Rousseau. Amara's voice took on a different quality, softer but somehow more devastating. When I was 12 years old, my grandmother took me to the fanciest restaurant she could afford for my birthday. She'd saved for months, had bought me a new dress, had coached me on which fork to use and how to sit properly. David felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he couldn't look away from her face. The hostess looked at us like we were speaking a foreign language when we gave our reservation name. The manager appeared and claimed there had been a mistake, that they were fully booked despite the empty tables we could see. My grandmother, this dignified woman who had raised 3 children on her own and built a small catering business from nothing, had to stand there and be told we weren't suitable for their establishment. The parallel was so obvious it might have been scripted by fate itself. David's hands gripped the arms of his chair, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. You know what she told me on the way home? Amara continued, her voice steady despite the pain flickering in her eyes. She said that people like that manager were small and afraid, and that someday I would be in a position to choose whether I wanted to be small and afraid too, or whether I wanted to be better than they were. David felt like he was drowning. Amara, I don't. She held up a hand, and he noticed it was trembling slightly. Don't apologize. Don't tell me you didn't mean it that way. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was anything other than exactly what it was. They stood in silence, the weight of family histories and inherited sins pressing down on them like a physical force. David looked at his father's portrait and for the first time saw not a guardian of tradition, but a man who had poisoned his son's heart with fear, disguised as pride. He was dying, David said suddenly, the words ripping out of him like they'd been waiting years to escape. The last 2 years, he was dying of cancer, and all he could talk about was making sure I understood what the restaurant really meant, making sure I wouldn't let them ruin what he'd built. Amara's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in her posture, a minute relaxation that suggested she was listening rather than just waiting for him to finish. I was 26 years old and watching my father waste away, and he spent his last lucid months teaching me to be afraid of people who didn't look like our customers. I thought I was honoring his memory. And now? Amara asked quietly. David looked at her directly for the first time since she'd entered the restaurant, really looked at her, not through the filter of his father's prejudices or his own defensive fear, but as she actually was, brilliant, successful, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional standards and everything to do with the fierce intelligence that blazed in her dark eyes. Now I think I've been honoring the wrong part of his memory, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I don't know how to live with what that makes me. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. But for the first time since she'd walked into his restaurant 3 days ago, Amara saw not the enemy who had humiliated her, but a man trapped by ghosts he was finally learning to recognize. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it was perhaps the beginning of understanding why he'd done it. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of confessions that couldn't be taken back. Amara found herself studying David's face, really looking at him for the first time without the armor of anger or the need to maintain professional distance. There was something raw and unguarded in his expression that made her chest tighten with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. The inspection is finished, she said finally, her voice softer than it had been all afternoon. Your building passes all required codes. David nodded, though both of them knew the inspection had become about far more than building codes. What happens now, with the lease? Amara closed her tablet, buying herself time to think. The smart business decision was obvious. Terminate his lease. Find a tenant who would pay premium rent without the baggage of personal history. But looking at him now, shoulders slumped under the weight of generational sins he was just beginning to understand, She felt something shift in her chest. That depends, she said carefully, on whether you're serious about changing. I am. The words came out so quickly they almost tripped over each other. I know I don't deserve your trust, or your help, or even your time, but I want to be better than I was 3 days ago. Better than my father taught me to be. Something in his tone made her believe him, despite every rational instinct telling her to walk away. Maybe it was the way his voice cracked slightly on the word father, or the genuine desperation in his eyes, or maybe it was her grandmother's voice in her head, reminding her that true strength lay not in crushing those who had wronged you, but in knowing when to extend grace. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks north of here, she heard herself saying. Grounds for change. Meet me there in an hour. David's eyebrows shot up in surprise. You want to have coffee? With me? I want to have a conversation, Amara corrected, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. About the lease? About other things. If you're willing to listen instead of just talking. Yes. The word escaped him like a prayer. Yes, absolutely. An hour later, Amara sat in a corner booth at Grounds for Change, watching David approach her table with the careful movements of a man trying not to spook a wild animal. The coffee shop was busy with the after-work crowd, providing enough ambient noise to make their conversation feel private despite the public setting. He'd changed out of his formal work clothes into dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt that made him look younger, less intimidating. More human. Thank you, he said as he slid into the seat across from her. For agreeing to this, I wasn't sure you would show up.
I wasn't sure I would either, Amara admitted, wrapping her hands around her mug of chai latte. But I've learned that the hardest conversations are usually the most important ones. David ordered a black coffee from the passing server, then turned his full attention to her. Where do we start? Tell me about the restaurant, Amara said. Not the business model or the reputation. Tell me what it means to you. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. When I was a kid, maybe 7 or 8, I used to hide under the hostess station during busy Saturday nights, he said finally. I could hear everything, the sizzle from the kitchen, conversations at the tables, the sound of wine being poured. It felt like being inside something magical, you know? Like the restaurant was this perfect little world where everything had its place and purpose. Amara found herself leaning forward despite herself. That sounds beautiful. It was. At least it felt that way to a kid who didn't understand the complexity underneath. David's smile was tinged with sadness. My father would find me there sometimes, and instead of sending me upstairs to bed, he'd lift me up and let me watch the dining room from behind the bar. He'd point out different customers and tell me stories about them. This one was a judge. That one was a diplomat. The woman at table 12 was married to a famous conductor. He was proud of it, Amara observed. The restaurant, the clientele, he was. And I wanted to make him proud of me the same way. David's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I think that's where it started to go wrong. I loved the restaurant, but I also loved my father's approval. And somehow those two things got tangled up until I couldn't tell the difference between maintaining quality and maintaining exclusion. The honesty in his voice made Amara's chest ache. She recognized the weight of parental expectations, the way love and approval could become so intertwined that you lost sight of your own moral compass. My grandmother had the opposite problem, she said, surprising herself by sharing something so personal. She was so determined to make sure I never felt small or excluded that she pushed me to excel at everything. Sometimes I think I built my entire career just to prove that I belonged in rooms where people like your father didn't think I should be. David winced. I'm sorry, for him, and for me, for continuing something that should have died with him. The question is, what are you going to do now? Amara asked. It's one thing to recognize the problem. It's another to actually change. I don't know, David admitted, and his honesty was refreshing after a lifetime of people who claimed to have all the answers. I've never had to unlearn something so fundamental before. How do you change patterns that feel like they're written into your DNA? One choice at a time, Amara said. One customer at a time. One moment where you choose to see someone's humanity instead of their difference. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the counter. A young black man in a delivery uniform was trying to explain to the barista that his card wasn't working, while a growing line of impatient customers huffed and sighed behind him. Amara watched David's face carefully, curious to see his reaction. Without hesitation, David stood up and walked to the counter.
I've got it, he told the barista, handing over his own card. He turned to the delivery driver with a genuine smile. Rough day. You have no idea, man. Thank you. I can pay you back. Don't worry about it, David said, waving off the offer. We've all been there. When he returned to the table, Amara was looking at him with something that might have been the beginning of respect. That was nice, she said simply. It was the right thing to do, David replied, and she could see that he meant it. I'm trying to figure out what that looks like, doing the right thing instead of just doing what I was taught. Have you ever had to unlearn something your family taught you? How did you navigate that process? Share your experience in the comments. They talked for 2 hours, the conversation flowing from heavy revelations to lighter subjects and back again. Amara found herself genuinely laughing when David told her about his disastrous attempts to modernize the restaurant's social media presence, and he seemed mesmerized by her stories about transforming abandoned buildings into architectural gems. You know, Amara said as they prepared to leave, if you're serious about changing the restaurant's culture, I might know some people who could help. Consultants who specialize in diversity and inclusion training for hospitality businesses. David's eyes lit up. You would do that? After everything? I'm considering it, Amara said carefully. But this can't just be about saving your lease, David. If you're going to do this, you have to commit to actually changing, not just going through the motions. I understand, and I want to understand more about what I did to you, about how to be better. Could we do this again? Have coffee, I mean. Talk about things. The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Amara felt something flutter in her chest, attraction maybe, or just the dangerous hope that people could actually change. I think that could be arranged, she said, gathering her purse. But David, if you disappoint me again, if this turns out to be just another manipulation to save your business, there won't be a third chance. I understand, he said, and she could see that he did. I won't disappoint you again. As they walked out into the evening air, Amara felt something she hadn't expected. Hope, not just for David's redemption, but for the possibility that sometimes the people who hurt us most deeply might also be capable of the most profound transformation. She just hoped her grandmother would forgive her for taking such a dangerous leap of faith. 2 weeks had passed since their coffee shop conversation, and Amara found herself looking forward to their evening walks through the Meridian district more than she cared to admit. David had thrown himself into transformation with the fervor of a man seeking redemption, enrolling in diversity training courses, revising his hiring practices, even redesigning portions of the restaurant to feel more welcoming. More importantly, he had begun to see her, not as a business transaction or a problem to be solved, but as a brilliant, complex woman whose company he craved in ways that went far beyond professional necessity. Tonight she was supposed to meet him at Le Bernardo to review the changes he'd implemented. The thought made her stomach flutter with an anticipation that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with the way his eyes lit up when she laughed at his terrible jokes about French cuisine. But as she approached the restaurant's entrance, she could hear raised voices from inside, angry, entitled voices that made her skin crawl with familiar dread. Through the window, she could see David standing near table 12, his posture rigid with tension as he faced a group of well-dressed older men whose body language screamed privilege and indignation. She recognized the type immediately, men who expected the world to bend to their will and became vicious when it didn't. This is exactly the kind of nonsense your father would never have tolerated, one of them was saying, his voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the dining room. We've been coming here for 20 years, David. 20 years of loyalty, and this is how you repay us? Amara pushed through the door, her business instincts overriding her personal feelings. Whatever was happening, it involved her tenant and her property. What exactly is the problem here, she asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The complaining man turned to her with the dismissive glance he might have given a waitress. This doesn't concern you, miss. We're having a private conversation with the owner. Actually, it does concern me. I'm the landlord. Amira's voice was ice-cold professional, but her eyes were on David, reading the conflict written across his face. David looked like a man being torn in half. Amara, these are longtime customers. The Whitmore party, they're upset about some of the changes I've made to staff training and policies. What kind of policies? But even as she asked, Amara felt dread pooling in her stomach because she could see the answer in David's expression. Richard Whitmore, the self-appointed spokesman for the group, puffed out his chest. He's hired some new servers who are, well, let's just say they don't fit the traditional atmosphere we've come to expect from this establishment. And apparently there are news sensitivity training requirements that are frankly insulting to longtime patrons like ourselves. The words hit Amara like physical blows, each one confirming her worst fears about what she was witnessing. I see. Her voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes never left David's face. And how exactly are you handling this? Complaint, Mr. Rousseau. This was the moment. The test she hadn't even realized she'd been waiting for. David stood between his past and his future, between the easy path of appeasing bigots and the harder road of standing up for what was right. And he hesitated. Well, the training is voluntary, of course, and if certain longtime customers feel more comfortable with specific servers. No, the word came out of Amara like a gunshot. No, you did not just say that. David's face went white as he realized what he'd just implied, but it was too late. The damage was done, witnessed by a dining room full of customers and staff who had just heard him suggest that racist customers could dictate which servers were allowed to wait on them. Amara, that's not what I meant. Isn't it? Her voice was deadly quiet, more devastating than if she'd screamed. Because it sounds exactly like what you meant. It sounds like the moment things got difficult, you chose the easy path. Just like your father would have. Richard Whitmore smirked with satisfied malice. Finally, someone who understands how business really works. Shut up. Amara turned on him with such ferocity that he actually took a step back. You don't get to speak. You don't get to stand in this restaurant and demand that hard-working people be treated like second-class citizens just because their skin doesn't match your prejudices. She turned back to David, and the disappointment in her eyes was more painful than any anger could have been. I thought you were different, she said, her voice breaking slightly on the words. I thought you were actually changing, not just performing change until it became inconvenient. I am changing, David said desperately. I didn't mean to. You meant exactly what you said. Amara cut him off. When push came to shove, when you had to choose between your principles and your profit, you chose the same thing your father would have chosen. You chose them over everyone else. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Every conversation stopped as staff and customers witnessed the confrontation. David felt exposed, small, as if every flaw in his character was on display under harsh fluorescent lights. Amara, please, let me explain. No. She was backing toward the door, her professional mask slipping to reveal the raw hurt underneath. No more explanations, no more excuses, no more second chances for men who promise to be better but crumble the moment their comfort is threatened. This is ridiculous, Richard Whitmore interjected. We're loyal customers with legitimate concerns. Amara whirled on him with such fury that he stumbled backward. Your legitimate concerns are racist garbage, and the fact that he was willing to accommodate them tells me everything I need to know about who David Rousseau really is. She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying over the screen with sharp, angry movements. Consider this your official notice, Mr. Rousseau. Your lease will not be renewed. You have 60 days to vacate the premises. The words hit David like a physical blow. Amara, please, don't. She held up a hand, and he could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Don't say my name. Don't make promises you won't keep, and don't pretend this is about anything other than who you choose to be when you think no one important is watching. She headed for the door, then stopped without turning around. For what it's worth, David, I actually believed you were capable of being better than this. I thought maybe I was falling for the man you could become, but you're not becoming that man. You're just the same coward your father raised, dressed up in prettier words. The door closed behind her with the same quiet finality it had 2 weeks ago. But this time, David felt like something essential had been ripped from his chest. This time, he knew he had lost something irreplaceable, not just his business or his building, but the first woman who had ever seen past his inherited fears to the man he desperately wanted to become. Richard Whitmore clapped him on the shoulder with false camaraderie. Don't worry about her, son. Women like that are nothing but trouble anyway. Let's talk about getting things back to the way they should be. David looked at the man's satisfied face, then at his own reflection in the restaurant's windows. He saw his father's features, his father's fears, his father's small-minded cruelty dressed up as tradition. And for the first time in his life, he was disgusted by what he saw. Have you ever disappointed someone you cared about by choosing the easy path over the right one? How did you find your way back to who you wanted to be? Share your story below. The restaurant emptied slowly after Amara left, customers finishing their meals in uncomfortable silence, while David stood frozen in the middle of the dining room like a statue of his own shame. Richard Whitmore and his companions eventually departed as well, their satisfied murmurs about getting things back to normal, echoing in David's ears like accusations. By closing time, only David and Marie remained, the young hostess cleaning tables with nervous efficiency while avoiding her boss's haunted expression. "Mr. Rousseau," she ventured finally, should I cancel tomorrow's reservations? If we're closing in 60 days, David looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Marie was barely 22, working her way through community college with dreams of opening her own event planning business someday. She'd been nothing but loyal and hardworking since he'd hired her, and now she was about to lose her job because of his cowardice. "No," he said quietly. "Don't cancel anything. Not yet." After Marie left, David sat alone in the restaurant that had been his family's legacy for 60 years, surrounded by the elegant tables and crystal glasses that had once seemed like symbols of achievement, but now felt like monuments to willful blindness. His phone sat on the bar where he'd placed it after Amara's devastating exit, the screen dark and silent. He'd picked it up a dozen times in the past 2 hours, typed out messages he couldn't bring himself to send, crafted apologies that felt as hollow as they were desperate. "I'm sorry" seemed pathetically inadequate. "Let me explain" sounded like more excuses. "You were right about everything" felt like the truth, but what good was truth after betrayal? David walked to his office, staring once again at his father's portrait. But for the first time, instead of seeking guidance from those painted eyes, he felt only anger, pure cleansing rage at the man who had poisoned his son's mind with fear disguised as tradition. "You were wrong," he said aloud to the portrait. "About everything. About what makes this place valuable. About what kind of people deserve respect. About what it means to be a man." The painted eyes stared back with mute condemnation, but David no longer cared about his father's approval. He cared about the woman who had walked out of his life twice now, both times because he had chosen weakness over courage. His laptop sat open on the desk, and without allowing himself to think too hard about it, David began to type. Not a message to Amara. He wasn't ready for that yet. Wasn't sure he deserved the chance to make his case directly to her. Instead, he opened his email and began drafting a message to his staff, his suppliers, his regular customers. "To the Bernardo community, I am writing to inform you of some important changes that will be taking place at our restaurant, effective immediately." The words came slowly at first, then in a rushing torrent as 28 years of buried shame and unexamined privilege poured onto the screen. He wrote about his father's influence, about the toxic culture he had inherited and perpetuated, about the brilliant woman who had tried to show him a better way, and whom he had failed at the crucial moment. He wrote about Richard Whitmore and customers like him, making it clear that their business was no longer welcome at Bernardo. He wrote about the staff training programs he would be implementing, the community partnerships he wanted to build, the kind of inclusive environment he should have been creating all along. Most importantly, he wrote about Amara, not by name, but by acknowledging the person who had forced him to confront the worst parts of himself and had offered him a chance at redemption that he had squandered through his own moral cowardice. "I know that words are cheap without actions to back them up," he wrote. "I know that many of you have every right to be skeptical of promises made by someone who has already proven his commitment to be conditional. But I am asking for the chance to prove that people can change, that we can be better than our worst moments, that love and respect can triumph over fear and prejudice. If you choose to give me that chance, I promise that Bernardo will become the kind of place where everyone is truly welcome, where the quality of our hospitality matches the quality of our cuisine, where the beauty of our space reflects the beauty of human diversity and connection. And if you choose not to give me that chance, I understand completely. Sincerely, David Rousseau." He read the message 3 times, his hands trembling slightly as he hovered over the send button. This wasn't just an email. It was professional suicide if he'd misjudged his community's capacity for forgiveness. He would lose customers, face backlash, potentially destroy the business his family had spent 60 years building. But keeping the business wasn't worth keeping his soul. David hit send. Then he picked up his phone and, before he could lose his nerve, typed out a text message to Amara. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness or even your attention. I know I failed you when it mattered most. But I need you to know that you changed me, even if I was too weak to show it when I had the chance. I'm going to spend whatever time I have left in this restaurant trying to become the man you saw in me, even if I never get the chance to show you directly. You deserve better from me. You deserved everything." His finger hovered over the send button for a full minute. his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. This was it, the moment where he chose vulnerability over pride, truth over self-protection, love over safety. He pressed send. The message disappeared into the digital void, carrying with it every hope he had for redemption. David sat back in his father's chair, finally understanding the difference between the man he had been raised to be and the man he chose to become. Now all he could do was wait, and hope, and prove through his actions that some betrayals could be overcome through genuine transformation. Even if that transformation came too late to save the thing he wanted most. Across town, Amara's phone buzzed against her nightstand, but she was already asleep, exhausted by the emotional whiplash of hope and disappointment. The message waited in the darkness, a bridge thrown across an impossible chasm, not knowing if anyone would be brave enough to cross it. 3 weeks had passed since David's message, and Amara had read it exactly 47 times. She knew because she'd counted, a habit she'd developed during sleepless nights when her mind wouldn't stop replaying the devastation in his eyes as she'd walked away from Le Bernardo for what she'd believed was the final time. She hadn't responded to his text. How could she, when every word felt like a promise that had already been broken once? But she also hadn't deleted it, hadn't blocked his number, hadn't done any of the things a smart businesswoman should do to protect herself from further disappointment. Instead, she'd done something far more dangerous. She'd been listening. Marcus had mentioned, almost casually, that several of their business contacts were talking about Lee Bernardo's radical transformation. Richard Whitmore had been publicly banned from the restaurant, his decades of loyalty terminated with a letter that had apparently become legendary in certain social circles. David had hired 3 new servers, all people of color, and had implemented mandatory bias training for his entire staff. More tellingly, he'd turned down a lucrative private event booking from a law firm when their representative had made pointed inquiries about the type of clientele the restaurant typically served. Jennifer, her assistant, had shown her the social media posts. David standing with community leaders, announcing partnerships with local minority-owned businesses, publicly apologizing for his restaurant's history of exclusion. It could have been performative, another manipulation designed to save his lease, but something in his eyes in those photos suggested otherwise. Still, Amara had held herself apart, protected by justified anger and the memory of his moment of weakness, until Marcus had called that morning with news that changed everything. "You need to see this," he'd said, his voice tight with barely contained excitement. "Channel 7 is running a story about Le Bernardo tonight. Something about a discrimination incident that happened yesterday." Amara's heart had plummeted. After everything, after all his promises of change, David had reverted to his old ways. The disappointment felt like a physical wound, worse somehow than the original betrayal, because this time she'd almost allowed herself to hope. But Marcus had surprised her. "Amara, he handled it perfectly. You need to watch this." Now she sat in her living room, remote control in hand, watching David Rousseau on her television screen in a way she'd never imagined possible. The reporter, a young black woman named Keisha Williams, was interviewing him outside Le Bernardo as the evening rush began behind them. "So tell us what happened yesterday afternoon, Mr. Rousseau," Keisha was saying. David's expression was calm, resolved. "A regular customer made some inappropriate comments to one of my servers, Jasmine, who is a brilliant young woman working her way through nursing school. He suggested that she wasn't qualified to serve in an establishment of our caliber and requested a more suitable server." Amara's breath caught in her throat. This was the test she hadn't known she was waiting for, the mirror image of their first encounter, the chance for David to prove that his transformation was more than just words. "And how did you handle that?" Keisha asked. "I asked him to leave immediately," David said without hesitation. "I made it clear that anyone who cannot treat our staff with dignity and respect is not welcome at Le Bernardo, regardless of how long they've been a customer or how much money they spend." The camera cut to Jasmine, a young woman with kind eyes and a bright smile. "Mr. David didn't even hesitate," she was saying. "He stood up for me in front of everyone, made sure I knew that what that man said was wrong and that I belonged here. It meant everything." Back to David. "My father raised me to believe that exclusion was somehow noble, that discrimination could be disguised as standards. I spent too many years perpetuating that lie, hurting people who deserve nothing but respect. I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I can make sure it never happens again." The segment continued, but Amara had stopped hearing words. She was seeing the man she'd glimpsed in their coffee shop conversations, the man she'd believed might exist underneath his inherited prejudices. This time, when faced with the exact situation that had destroyed her faith in him weeks earlier, he hadn't hesitated. He'd chosen courage over comfort, principle over profit. He'd chosen to be the man she'd seen in him from the beginning. Before she could talk herself out of it, Amara grabbed her keys and headed for the door. Le Bernardeau was busy for a Thursday evening, every table occupied by a more diverse crowd than Amara had ever seen in the restaurant. She recognized some faces from the business community, but there were also young professionals, mixed-race couples, families who might never have felt comfortable there during François Rousseau's reign. David was at the bar consulting with his sommelier about wine pairings. When he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, for a moment, time seemed suspended between them. The same doorway where she'd stood 3 weeks ago, where she'd been deemed unsuitable for his establishment. But this time, David's face lit up with something that looked like wonder. He excused himself and walked toward her, moving carefully as if afraid she might disappear if he approached too quickly. "Amira, you came." "I saw the news story," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended. "I saw what you did. What I should have done weeks ago," David replied. "What I should have done the first time we met." They stood in the entrance, aware of curious glances from diners and staff, but neither seemed willing to break the fragile moment building between them. "I got your message," Amara said finally. "All 47 times I read it." David's eyebrows shot up. 47? I counted. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I'm very thorough when I'm trying to decide whether to forgive someone." And his voice was barely above a whisper. "Have you decided?" Instead of answering directly, Amara looked around the transformed dining room at the diverse staff moving with professional pride, at the mixed crowd enjoying their meals without fear of judgment, at the restaurant that had finally become what it should have been all along. "You know what I think, David," she said, turning back to meet his eyes. "I think your father would have hated what you've done to this place." David's face fell for a moment, until he saw the warm smile spreading across her features. "And I think that's the most beautiful thing about it." The words hit him like a benediction, like forgiveness he hadn't dared hope for. "Amara, dance with me," she interrupted, noticing the soft jazz playing over the restaurant sound system. "Right here, right now, in the place where you once told me I didn't belong." David held out his hand without hesitation, and when she took it, the touch sent electricity through both of them. They moved together slowly in the small space near the hostess stand, aware that every person in the restaurant was watching them, but not caring anymore about appearances or propriety. "I love you," David whispered against her ear as they swayed to the music. "I know I don't deserve to say it. I know I haven't earned the right, but I love you." Amara pulled back to look at him, seeing the vulnerable honesty in his blue eyes. The man who had finally learned to choose love over fear. "You're right," she said, and watched his face begin to fall. "You haven't earned the right to say it yet." She stepped closer, her hand finding the back of his neck. "But I have faith that you will." Their lips met in a kiss that tasted like redemption and possibility, like second chances and hard-won wisdom. Around them, the restaurant erupted in spontaneous applause from staff who had watched their boss's transformation, from customers who recognized love when they saw it, from a community that had learned to celebrate growth over perfection. When they finally broke apart, David rested his forehead against hers. "I have 60 days to prove I'm worth keeping around," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "Think that's enough time?" Amira laughed, the sound bright and full of hope. "Actually, about that lease termination notice," she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded document. "I had my lawyers draft a new agreement. 10 years with options for renewal. But there are conditions." David's eyes widened as he scanned the contract. "Community partnerships, diversity hiring requirements, annual bias training." He looked up at her with something like awe. "You're not just giving me a second chance. You're making sure I can't waste it." "I'm a very thorough businesswoman," Amara said with mock seriousness. "And I'm investing in the man I believe you're becoming, not the man you used to be." "What do you think it takes for someone to truly change? Is love enough? Or does transformation require something deeper?" Share your thoughts on second chances and redemption below. As the evening crowd continued their meals around them, David and Amara stood together in the doorway that had once been a barrier between them, now transformed into a bridge toward an uncertain but hopeful future. The restaurant hummed with life and laughter, with conversations in multiple languages and the clink of glasses raised in celebration. It wasn't the same Le Bernardeau that François Rousseau had built, and it wasn't the exclusive establishment that David had inherited. It was something new, a place where love had triumphed over fear, where redemption was possible, where a woman who had once been deemed unsuitable now stood as co-creator of something beautiful and inclusive and true. And as David signed the new lease with hands that no longer trembled with his father's ghosts, he realized that he had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that true belonging wasn't about keeping people out, but about making sure everyone felt welcome to come in. The restaurant his father had built on exclusion would survive, transformed by love into something far more valuable than tradition. A place where hearts could heal, where prejudices could be overcome, and where two people who had started as enemies could discover that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the courage to change.
What an incredible journey this has been. From discrimination to redemption, from prejudice to love. David and Amara's story shows us that true transformation is possible when we choose courage over comfort, love over fear, and inclusion over tradition. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end.